90% of wealthy families lose their fortune by the third generation, not through bad luck, not through market crashes, through their own children. So here's the paradox this story is built on. The most hated monopolist in American history, a man newspapers has called a robber baron, a man the government sued and dismantled in the largest trust case of its era, built the one family fortune that has survived that curse for over 130 years, across 7 generations and counting. Every other dynasty we could tell you about ends the same way. A founder claws his way to the top. His grandchildren sell the paintings to pay the tax bill. The name becomes a street, a plaque, a footnote. The Rockefellers should have ended that way too. They had all the ingredients for collapse: obscene wealth, public hatred, and heirs who were, by any honest account, deeply flawed people. One vanished into the ocean and was never found. Another was branded the family's black sheep and spent his 20s drunk in New York nightclubs. And yet the money still there. Not because the Rockefellers were smarter than the families who lost everything, because one anxious, overlooked son did something almost nobody in his position has ever done. He refused to hand his children the fortune. He built a cage for it instead. This is the story of how a family built a machine strong enough to survive its own people. Part 1. The Man Who Feared Money. To understand why the Rockefellers built what they built, you have to understand what the founder came from, because he wasn't running toward wealth. He was running away from chaos. John Davison Rockefeller was born in 1839 in upstate New York, the son of a traveling con man. His father sold fake medicine out of the back of a wagon, used a second fake identity to court a second, secret wife, and vanished from town to town whenever the lies caught up with him. Historian Ron Chernow, who spent years reconstructing Rockefeller's life for his biography Titan, describes a childhood defined by instability, a household where money showed up unpredictably and disappeared just as fast. That is the environment that shaped him. By 16, working as an assistant bookkeeper in Cleveland for less than $1 a day, young Rockefeller had already started a personal ledger, recording every cent he earned, spent, and gave away. He kept records like a man trying to impose order on a world that had given him none. Here's the first curiosity worth sitting with. The same instinct for obsessive control that made Rockefeller one of the most ruthless businessmen in American history is the exact instinct that, 2 generations later, would save his family's fortune from ruin. Discipline wasn't a personality quirk. It was survival inherited. By his mid-20s he had moved into oil refining, right as Pennsylvania's oil boom was reshaping the American economy. And where his competitors gambled on finding the next gusher, Rockefeller ignored the drilling entirely. He went after the boring middle of the business, the refineries, the barrels, the railroads that hauled it all to market. Nobody made headlines refining oil, but whoever controlled that stage controlled everyone who depended on it. In 1870, he consolidated his holdings into a single company, Standard Oil, and then he did something that would define his reputation for the rest of his life and beyond it. He convinced railroads to secretly give him rebates on his own shipments. Then he pushed further, arranging for a cut of what his competitors paid to ship their oil to, meaning his rivals were unknowingly funding the very company trying to destroy them. Within 6 weeks of one such scheme in 1872, Standard Oil absorbed 22 of its 26 competitors in Cleveland. Historians still call it the Cleveland Massacre. By 1880, roughly 9 out of every 10 barrels of oil refined in the United States, passed through Rockefeller's hands. He wasn't rich. He was something the country had never had to think about before. A single private citizen who could quietly control an entire industry that the whole nation depended on. Newspapers started calling Standard Oil the octopus, a creature with tentacles reaching into every state legislature, every competing business, every corner of daily life. Which raises the obvious question the entire country asking by the turn of the century. If one man could grow this powerful, this untouchable, who or what could ever stop him? Part 2. The woman who took him down, and the court that made him richer. The answer came from someone with almost no institutional power at all. Starting in 1902, a journalist named Ida Tarbell began publishing a serialized investigation into Standard Oil in McClure's magazine. It ran for 19 installments over 2 years before becoming a book. Tarbell wasn't a critic. Her own father had been a small oil producer in Pennsylvania, one of the very people crushed by Standard Oil's rebate schemes years earlier. Methodically, without sensationalism, she laid out exactly how the empire had been built. The secret rail deals, the deliberately crushed competitors, the quiet consolidation of an entire industry under one roof. Her reporting is widely credited with helping launch the era of American investigative journalism, and with supplying the evidence trail that eventually reached federal prosecutors. In 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly and ordered it broken into more than 30 separate companies. This was supposed to be the ending. The nation, through its highest court, deciding that one man had simply grown too large and cutting him back down. Instead, it made him richer than he had ever been. Here's the mechanism, and it's worth explaining plainly because it's the kind of detail that gets lost in the drama. Rockefeller didn't hold his wealth in cash. He held it in shares, and when Standard Oil was broken apart, he still owned roughly a quarter of every single piece that resulted from the split. Those pieces went on to become companies you still recognize today, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron among them. Freed to compete independently, several of them ended up worth far more separately than they ever had been combined. The breakup meant to punish him instead multiplied his fortune. By 1916, newspapers were calling him America's first billionaire. To understand how large that number actually was, you can't just look at the raw figure. At his peak around 1913, Rockefeller's personal wealth is estimated near $900 million. Adjusted for today's economy, that number alone doesn't capture it. What matters is that his fortune equaled somewhere around 2% of the entire United States' annual economic output. 2 cents of every dollar the whole country produced, sitting with one family. No American would command a comparable share of the national economy again for roughly a century. Which should terrify you if you know anything about what happens next to fortunes this size. Because a pile of money that large isn't just an asset. It's a target for lawsuits, for flattering relatives, for lazy heirs, for every kind of decay that has destroyed nearly every dynasty in American history before or since. Rockefeller was going to die eventually, and on paper, everything about this fortune was set up to vanish exactly the way every other American fortune this size always had. Part 3. The Graveyard of Great American Fortunes. Before we get to what the Rockefellers did differently, you need to see what normal looks like, because the pattern is so consistent it has its own name. Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. It's an old proverb, not unique to America, and it's survived because it keeps proving itself true. The first generation builds the fortune through hard, often ruthless work. The second generation, raised in comfort, manages it downward. The third generation, raised in nothing but luxury, finishes the job. Look at the Vanderbilts. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, died in 1877 holding around $155 million, at a time when that sum reportedly exceeded the entire U.S. Treasury's holdings. His son doubled figure to nearly $200 million and briefly became the richest man on the planet. Then came the spending. The breakers in Newport Marble House, Biltmore, the largest private residence ever built in the United States. Palaces, not investments. By 1973, when over 100 Vanderbilt descendants gathered for a family reunion, not a single one of them was a millionaire. The largest fortune in Gilded Age America evaporated in roughly 3 generations. Or look at Frank Woolworth, who built a retail empire out of 5-and-dime stores. His granddaughter, Barbara Hutton, inherited a fortune in her youth worth something in the ballpark of $1 billion in today's terms. She married 7 times, gave much of it away, and by the time she died in 1979, what remained amounted to a few $1,000s. Newspapers had nicknamed her the poor little rich girl decades earlier. The nickname turned out to be a prophecy. The Astors followed the same road at a slower pace, a foreign real estate fortune that dominated New York society for a century before quietly thinning into obscurity. An advisory firm called the Williams Group studied thousands of wealthy families over 2 decades and found that roughly 70% had lost their fortunes by the end of the second generation, and 90% by the end of the third. Researchers still debate the precision of that exact figure, but almost nobody disputes the direction. 9 dynasties out of 10 gone within 3 generations, regardless of how the money was made. So by every historical precedent, the Rockefeller fortune, larger than any of these, hated more publicly than any of these, inherited by heirs just as flawed as any of these, should be a Wikipedia footnote by now. It isn't, and the reason has almost nothing to do with the money itself. Part 4. The son nobody bet on. If John D. Rockefeller was an anaconda, patient, cold, and unstoppable, his only son looked like the opposite in every way. John D. Rockefeller Jr. grew up anxious, dutiful, and visibly uncomfortable, carrying a surname that a large part of the country used as a synonym for greed. That discomfort deepened in 1914, when a violent strike at a Colorado coal operation controlled by the family ended in gunfire and fire at a workers' tent colony in Ludlow. A tragedy in which roughly 20 people died, including women and children. It remains one of the darkest chapters connected to the Rockefeller name, and any honest account of this family has to include it. This fortune was not built or defended gently. By most measures, Junior was exactly the kind of heir historians would point to as a coming collapse. Anxious, guilt-ridden, lacking his father's hardness. You would have bet against him. That would have been the wrong bet, because the thing that made him seem weak, his fear, his caution, his refusal to simply enjoy what he'd inherited, turned out to be the exact quality that saved the fortune. Junior did something that goes against almost every instinct a wealthy parent has. He refused to hand the money directly to his own children. Think about what that decision actually meant, emotionally, for a father. The natural impulse of someone sitting on a fortune this size is to give, to pass the cash, the property, the shares straight into your children's hands so they can enjoy the life you built for them. That impulse is exactly what buried the Vanderbilts. Give a person a spendable fortune, and sooner or later, someone lights the fuse. Instead, in 1934, and again with a second set of trusts in 1952, Junior locked the heart of the family's wealth into a structure managed not by any single heir, but by a bank. Here's the part that matters most, explained simply. In a trust like this, the money doesn't belong to the heirs to spend. It belongs to the trust itself. The heirs receive income, the fruit the tree produces every year, for their entire lives. But they cannot, they cannot gamble it away, hand it to the wrong spouse, or lose it in a bad decade. A reckless heir in this structure can burn through a single year's income at the absolute worst. He can never touch the root. You cannot spend to zero what you were never handed in the first place. There was a second enemy this structure was built to survive, and it's one that quietly kills fortunes that would otherwise last. Taxes. Every time wealth passes from one generation to the next, a portion gets taken. Across 3 or 4 generations, those repeated cuts alone can hollow out even a well-managed dynasty. The trust structure was designed to carry wealth across generations without being fully re-taxed at every single handoff, letting the core survive while other fortunes bled out a little more at every funeral. But a locked vault on its own isn't a complete answer. A fortune this size is a living, sprawling organism. Stocks, land, companies, legal obligations, charitable commitments, and it has to be actively run by someone, which brings us to the second half of the machine. Part 5. The office on the 56th floor. For more than 80 years, the entire Rockefeller fortune was managed out of one office, the 56th floor of 30 Rockefeller Plaza, a suite the family simply referred to by its number. Room 5600. Its formal name was Rockefeller Family and Associates, and what it did was, on paper, almost boring. It handled the investments, the legal matters, the taxes, and the charitable giving for the entire extended family as one coordinated operation, rather than leaving each branch of the family to manage its own slice separately. That single choice mattered enormously, because scatter is how fortunes usually die. Cousins fighting cousins, one branch making reckless bets while another plays it safe. Disputes dragging into courtrooms that eat up decades of wealth in legal fees alone. Room 5600 existed to settle those disputes quietly, internally, before they ever became public. From the 1940s onward, the brothers of the family's third generation met on a regular schedule to decide together what causes the family would fund, pooling much of their giving into a single vehicle, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. In doing so, they didn't just manage a fortune. They turned it into something closer to an institution, and institutions, unlike individual heirs, don't collapse over one bad marriage or one reckless year. The office did one more thing that quietly saved the family. It moved the wealth out of the single industry that had created it. A fortune tied to one company dies when that company does, which is a large part of what happened to families whose wealth was locked into railroads that eventually declined. The Rockefellers spread their holdings out of oil and into real estate, banking, and a wide range of other industries, so that no single collapse in any one sector could take the whole fortune down with it. Then came the third piece, and it's the piece most people misunderstand entirely. Part 6. Giving a survival strategy. It's tempting to read the Rockefellers' enormous philanthropy as simple generosity or as an image repair campaign after Ludlow, and both of those things are true, to a degree. But the giving also did something structural that almost nobody at the time would have described as a financial strategy. Across 2 generations, the family gave away more than $1 billion. A single founding gift of $600,000 in 1890 helped establish the University of Chicago, which the elder Rockefeller reportedly called the best investment of his life. Family funding built what is now Rockefeller University, an institution connected to dozens of Nobel laureates over the following century. During the depths of the Great Depression, Junior poured $100 million into building Rockefeller Center, putting tens of thousands of construction workers to work while much of the country stood in unemployment lines. But look past the buildings for a moment to what the giving did inside the family. When you raise children to believe that a fortune comes with responsibility attached, that the family name means hospitals and universities and public works, not just yachts and townhouses, you change what it means, psychologically, to inherit that name. A Vanderbilt grandchild inherited permission to spend. A Rockefeller grandchild inherited a job. That's not a small distinction. It's arguably the whole difference between the two families' outcomes. Now, here's where the story gets uncomfortable, and where it would be dishonest to pretend the structure made everyone in this family turn out fine. Because it didn't. The machine protected the money. It never protected the people. Part 7. What the money couldn't save. In November of 1961, 23-year-old Michael Rockefeller, a great-grandson of the founder, was on an art collecting expedition off the coast of what was then Dutch New Guinea when the boat he was traveling in capsized roughly 10 miles from shore. With rescue nowhere in sight, Michael tied 2 empty fuel canisters to his body and attempted to swim for land. He was never seen again. His father, then the governor of New York, flew across the world and funded extensive search efforts along that coastline. None of it mattered. No body was ever recovered, and to this day no one can say with certainty what happened to him. A court declared him legally dead 3 years later, with nothing to bury. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, because it cuts directly against the entire premise of generational wealth. All the money in the world, arguably the largest private fortune the industrial world had ever produced, could not save one 23-year-old member of the family from the ocean. The trust structure that protected the fortune had absolutely no power over the life. Then, Winthrop. Among the 5 Rockefeller brothers of the 3rd generation, the ones who would go on to run banks, museums, and states, Winthrop was known as the family's black sheep. He drank heavily as a young man, drifted through New York's nightlife, and went through a bitter, tabloid-covered divorce. In almost any other wealthy family, a figure like Winthrop is exactly how a fortune bleeds out. The weak link who spends recklessly and drains what's left. Except the trust structure made that specific kind of damage structurally impossible. Winthrop could never touch the core of the fortune, no matter how far he drifted, because the money simply wasn't his to lose. And ironically, that limitation seems to have freed him to rebuild an identity elsewhere. He relocated to Arkansas, built a working cattle ranch, and in 1966 was elected governor of Arkansas, the first Republican to hold that office there since Reconstruction. He pushed reforms in one of the country's poorest states until cancer took his life in 1973. His brothers tell the rest of the story. John III helped build Lincoln Center and founded the Population Council before dying in a car accident in 1978. Nelson served 4 terms as governor of New York and later as vice president of the United States. Lawrence became an early venture investor and one of the leading conservationists of his generation. David ran Chase Manhattan Bank, became the family's central patriarch for decades, and died in 2017 at the age of 101. the last surviving grandchild of the founder. One family, one locked fortune, one shared upbringing, and out of it, a young man lost at sea, a black sheep governor, a vice president, a conservationist, and a banker who lived past 100. The structure was never designed to guarantee good people. It was designed to survive the bad years, the weak links, and the tragedies without collapsing. And by any honest measure, it did exactly that. Part 8. What's left and what isn't. Here's where the legend and the reality start to diverge. Because if you go looking the Rockefeller empire today expecting to find it fully intact, you won't. The family no longer owns Rockefeller Center. In 1989, a Japanese investment firm, Mitsubishi Estate, took a controlling stake in the company managing the property, and that wasn't even the first sign of change. The family had already brought in outside investors years earlier, and in 1995, the partnerships controlling the center filed for bankruptcy, carrying more than $1 billion in debt. Today, the building belongs to other owners entirely. The Rockefeller name is still carved into the limestone. The income isn't. Room 5600 is gone too. In 2015, after more than 80 years, the family's management office closed that chapter for good, eventually restructuring into an outside investment firm that now manages a large pool of client money, of which the Rockefeller family itself represents only a small fraction. Do the simple math on what's actually left, and the honest answer isn't a triumphant one. Adjusted forward, the founder's peak fortune would be worth tens of billions in today's terms. What Forbes estimates the extended family holds today, spread across a seventh generation and dozens of descendants, is a much smaller, though still substantial, figure, no longer large enough to place any individual Rockefeller among America's wealthiest people. The last Rockefeller to appear on that kind of list died in 2017. No one has replaced him since. So this isn't really a story about a fortune that grew forever. Over $500 million was deliberately given away by design. What remained was divided among branch after branch of an expanding family tree. The wealth wasn't hoarded into infinity, it was on purpose taken apart. And there's one final twist worth sitting with. The fortune began entirely in oil, the ruthless, monopolistic empire of Standard Oil. In 2014, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund announced it was pulling its investments out of fossil fuels. 2 years later, a related family fund went further, formally divesting from the largest direct corporate descendant of Standard Oil itself. The great-grandchildren of the man who built the most infamous oil monopoly in American history stood up, generations later, and walked away from oil entirely, and it cost the family nothing existential, because by then the fortune had long since outgrown the industry that created it. Clothing. You are probably never going to inherit an oil monopoly. Neither am I. But the lesson underneath this story doesn't need 9 zeros to apply. Every family that hands its wealth to the next generation faces the same basic choice the Rockefellers faced in 1934. You can pass it on as spendable cash, a fuse waiting for a match, and hope your children are among the rare ones who never light it. Or you can do the harder, less generous feeling thing. Build a structure that protects the money from the very people you're trying to help. A family with a single small business can put it in a trust so no bad divorce or reckless year can force a sale. Parents with a modest estate can leave income instead of a lump sum. A family with nothing but a name and a set of values can still sit its children down and teach them, deliberately, what money is actually for. The Rockefellers were not smarter than the Vanderbilts. They were not luckier than the Astors. If anything, They were more afraid, afraid enough that one anxious, doubted son looked at the same fortune everyone else in his position treated as a blessing, and saw it instead for what it actually is. Something that destroys families by default, unless somebody builds walls strong enough to hold it up. He built those walls before the money ever arrived, and that is the only real reason that when a Rockefeller plunged into the sea, and when another nearly drank away his future, and when the founder himself finally lay down and died, the fortune didn't follow any of them into the ground. Every other family we could have told you about tonight is a grave. This one, still, is a machine. And it isn't the only one. Next time, we go looking at a fortune built the same decade, in the same country, by an just as ruthless, but with none of these walls in place. A family that owned the ground beneath an entire growing city, and still, within 3 generations, had almost nothing left to show for it, because size was never the thing that saved anyone. Structure was.